It's now my pleasure to welcome Elder Willie Ermine and Elder Reg Crowshoe to bring us our keynote today.
Okay, ik kan iets met zijn gebruiks. Zo kaap ik iets toe toch binnen aan de gezichtsiko. Stone koka niet dynamska. Okay, and good morning. Just was asked to just introduce Dr. Reg Crowshoe, elder from Big Gunny, and Dr. Willie Ermine to discuss ethics and ceremony between worldviews. So we just want to quickly thank the organizers for creating this forum to bridge worldviews, as we heard yesterday morning, to share our knowledge and gifts here, and to the people of Treaty 6 who welcome us into the territory, and to my friend Bob. Thank you for that prayer that guide our work. So really quickly, ethical space as ceremony is based on the negotiation of ethical order and looking at a process for developing ethical engagement where different perspectives on research meet. This confluence or meeting of Indigenous and Western worldviews creates an ethical space where the process or practice of First Nations principles, such as OCAP, the ownership, control, access, and possession of our information, data, and traditional knowledge, and ethical research practices can be mutually developed, respecting the role of two worldviews in the management of data. So ethics and ceremony between worldviews contemplates existing power structures and social inequities between Indigenous peoples and Western Eurocentric society. Dr. Reg Crowshoe and Willie Ermine will explore worldviews and cultural confusion and interpretation and suggest how First Nations and researchers or partners may negotiate respectful research relationships, build cultural safety, and breathe life into OCAP. So it is also really important, I think, to distinguish between the blanket designation of Aboriginal when speaking of First Nations and First Nations principles, values, and beliefs, especially when it comes to cultural interpretation. As Dr. Crowshoe will attest, there's a tendency to make blanket statements or labels or put labels on people, as is evident in the media and the general public when speaking about First Nations. The word Aboriginal describes the collective of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So it's important to distinguish that when we're talking about Aboriginal people, to include that, there are different distinct groups there. And we don't speak for the Métis as they don't speak for us. Out of respect, it's a respectful process. So in order to truly bridge worldviews and create meaningful actions, as we heard in the opening of this symposium, we must be respectful of Indigenous groups and avoid misconceptions and really abusive language. So really quickly, I think I'll turn it over to Mr. Ermine, but I think some of the purpose really was to look at the treaty relationship. We hear all the time, we are all Albertans, where the First Nations say, we are all treaty people, because we signed treaties with your forefathers. We all benefited from that. So I think we're going to be talking about that, the territory, jurisdiction issues, a validation process, the oral and the written, the songs as authorities that we still sing to this day, the parallels of worldviews where we can find that ethical space, traditional knowledge of ownership, looking at funding, equity in both systems, ethics in research and as ceremony. So the purpose really is to look at ethical space as ceremony, the ownership of our data, ethical engagement, looking at negotiating this ethical space and implementing the First Nations principles of OCAP, looking at respect for First Nations self-determination and information management and jurisdiction over their own information. So really looking at how OCAP and ethical research can assist First Nations researchers and partners in negotiating those respectful research practices and looking at exercising that jurisdiction and really working together in true partnership. So some of the benefits, of course, we rebuild trust. Of course, we've been studied to death, And so really, we have to try to build that trust amongst the partners and the communities we work with, and have a more participatory process and promote First Nations analysis or First Nations researchers. And finally, to get more relevant, meaningful results for our people. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Willie Ermine. Thank you.
Testing, testing. Am I on? Oh, there I go. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad Brent Scout didn't make a decree, compromise all of us Cree in the room here. Nigang na naskumau kitem no gagagismut nistamik te paksimu ya nam maya gagisimun higagi goi gwantunamu ya niga nanto eke ka nanto ge titot nista. Just thank the elder. I too, I'm just grabbing onto those prayers to make sure I don't say anything that's wrong. I hope I say everything the way it's meant to be. So thank you, Elder Bob. What Brent talked about there, what he presented was sort of the external. When we talk about ethical space, we're getting into the area of ethics. Let me see if I can. Getting into an area of ethics, and working with ethics and values is really hard. What I want to do this morning is in a crash course kind of way, link up this idea of ethics with spirituality, and then how we work with spirituality. Because many of us, spirituality is very nebulous. It has no place in research, at least in Western research. But we have to somehow put it in there. So what I want to do is make those linkages in the 20 minutes that's allotted to me here. So this is a crash course. So it's a long story. It's a difficult, tedious, precarious task to kind of link up all these issues into a way that we can understand and work with work with ethics. So I want to show you that picture right now that you're seeing on a screen, and the beginning of the story talks about that that image that you're looking at right now on a screen is you. This is you, as a researcher, as a parent, as a human being. This is your picture, and that's what I want you to go away from here with this deeply etched in your mind, that this is what you look like. And then after this talk today, that you should be bouncing out those walls, skipping and whistling and just hugging everybody and trying to get home and hug your children and all, look at your research proposal, throw it off to the side and write a new one. So Let me get into it then. So ethical spaces is how we treat each other as human beings, because we're talking about ethics, Reg, right? We're talking about ethics, and it's an internal kind of thing. It's an inward. It's a spiritual thing. So how we treat each other as human beings, this should be primary in our research. So it's our basic capacity to recognize what harms and enhances well-being of sentient creatures. Now, basic capacity in that sentence there is an absolutely loaded word that we, to know what our capacity, you have to know what you know, or you have to know what you don't know. It's something like that. So basic capacity to know the actions that you do, the research that you do, how it harms the communities that you work with, how it can harm or enhance. The impulse that we have as researchers when we put in our proposals to government is to list all our negative attributes, the negative things about our community, all the illnesses, and we can come up with many of those. That's the first impulse. We list down all that's wrong with the Native community, and we're talking about health research. We should call it illness research. When we talk about health, it has to be the optimum of the people, and this is how we start to think about it. So when we talk about the ethics, morals, it's an inward kind of a knowledge that we have to think about. So how we link it up to spirituality, and bear with me, these are my thoughts. But that we know that in our home, our old people tell us a lot about ethics. It's just a natural conversation that they have, that ethics is something very human. And a lot of old people, I understand them to say, our communities were finished, our societies were finished, we understood ethics. We know what ethics is. We have to continue talking about ethics. We have to train the rest of Canada what ethics is. And so this is how, but how do we do it? Because we, when we talk about ethics, values, and our spirit, and yesterday was such a wonderful day to listen to all the speakers, the youth. It was, I was sitting there all day, just, practically in tears many times. But to link it up to spirituality, because spirituality, it's kind of a nebulous thing. It's very hard to get a grasp of what spirituality is. Yet everybody in this room, everybody has it. How do we work with it? That's the difficulty. How do we start working with this? So that's why I see it's kind of urgent that we have to make spirituality a very practical thing that we can work with. And so this is how I try to do it. So spirit is having to do with inwardness and feelings and emotions and values rather than the physical outwardness, the way I'm dressed, the way we comb our hair this morning and all that. As an example, and I just put down this reference here, Third Night Postulates of Plains Creek Conversation. It talks a lot about how silence works, how you avoid direct eye contact. These are the ways of interaction. Do not talk to fill conversational pauses, avoid direct eye contact. These are things that start to remind us that when we encounter other people, that's where ethics starts to play. When we encounter other people, what essentially is happening is that we are encountering a stranger. And I usually go through an exercise, but we won't have time. But when we encounter a stranger, put that scenario in your mind. What happens when you encounter a stranger? What are the thoughts that happen? Do you push them away? Do you run away? What is it that you do when you encounter a stranger that's very different from you? So that's a scenario when human beings encounter each other. What are our normal or first impulses, how we react to the other people? So it talks about all of that. And what we start to find out is that when we examine it closely is that there are energies that happen between people. They're unseen because they're at the spiritual level, they're at the values level, they're at the, at the level we can't, they're not tangible, we can't put our hands on it, therefore we don't know how to work with those things. But, that's what ethics is all about, that we have to start thinking about energies now. So linking up this idea of spirituality with energies, you feel the other people when you encounter them. When you meet people, you feel them. You also impact other people. The young people that were talking here yesterday were talking about these feelings, what they were, yet we can't see those feelings. We don't know how to work with them. We just don't know how to work with the unknowns. So a lot of our discussion has to be on these energies that happen between people. So this is how I try to link it up. The spirituality having to do with the human spirit, which is unseen. Then an unseen is unknown. We don't know how to work with it. So how do we approach the unknown? So when we start thinking about energies, then spiritual may be energy at the most primary level. If we think it up, at least up to that point, that the energies that we have, we know you feel it this morning. Some of you might have just jumped out of bed and then just started whistling and combing your hair and everything like that, just really raring to go. And some of you, of course, you just kind of drag yourself out of the bed, So energies are very important when we start thinking about them, how they influence our behaviors, and they should influence absolutely the kind of research and writing that we do. So spirit may be also thought of as an energy. Now, if we start thinking like that, we have a discussion about the spiritual. Some criteria of spiritual and energy are, it's an aliveness. There's an aliveness, to this, to the idea of spirit. When we were praying this morning, of course you're not praying to anything that's dead, not alive. We expect results. When we said collective prayer here, we expect a response. We're praying to something that's alive. So having a consciousness, that it's aware of what the work we're trying to do, for the youth, our communities, and etc. It's an intelligence. It's smarter than us. We ask for guidance. So, and we expect a response when we pray. We expect a response. Why pray if we don't expect a response? So therefore, we start to think that spirit, when we work with spirit, it can animate, it can move, it can influence, it can make things happen. Spirituality, prayer, sweat lodges, ceremony, all that, make things happen. So these are, it's animate, and similarly, energies that we have, that we carry around, no matter what, they also animate. They also move the people that you encounter. Other people's energies will also move you. So, what is and how do we start to look at the culture then to make sure that I'm not I'm not going crazy mentally. Maybe I am going crazy. Maybe these are just thoughts of somebody that's stuck in a cubicle in the office and having crazy thoughts. And so I thought I'd make it. How do I start proving this? So since we're talking about health, Hampton was the one that told me, if you want to know what is an indigenous idea, because many times we don't know how to separate indigenous ideas from Western ideas. We've become so enmeshed, that it's a hard time for us Cree people to know what are absolute Cree ideas. So he said, feed it to the language and see what comes out. So that's what I did. What is health? And I look in the dictionary, and at least 20 words jump right out and talk about health in Cree. And one of them is miumachihuan. Now, I have to understand what this word means. So I take the root word, and we know that the first root word, miu, means miuasin, miugi sigao, miuasin. You look beautiful. Miuasin is a word that talks about the positive, the good. It's always, positive, good, nice. And then the second root word, machi, it's this, it's movement. It's movement, human movement. And the third root, ho, that's the one that you'll be hearing pretty soon at Christmas time. There's a red. No, that means the state of being, the condition you are in, the state of being. So far what we have is you're in a state of good, positive movement. And then win, of course, is the one a suffix that tells us that we had a whole system of health, that health is not foreign to our people. We don't need people to come and rescue us with our health conditions. We have systems, and this is the root that tells us that we had systems. And this word is an ancient word, that we were finished societies. So what we have is the whole system of being in a state of good, positive movement. So somebody phones you up, Reg, how are you doing, Reg, today? Oh, I'm in a state of good, real good, positive movement. So even when you're answering your phone call, you'll be working with cultural ideas. But that it seems superficial. So I had to take this other word, movement, and take it further. What are we actually doing when we do movement? When we're walking around, or I take that word matsi, and I take the first root. Ma is a word that talks about repeating over and over again. something that's being repeated over and over again, ma. And chi is the one I had difficulty with that one, because what I had to do was bring in all the words, and try to extract the concept that's embedded within all those words. So chi was a hard one. And the way I eventually figured it out, and does somebody have a needle? Do you have a needle? What would you be doing with a needle? You take a needle, when you go home today, you take a needle, maybe on the way home buy a magnifying glass. Because what you're going to do when you get home is gently prick yourself with that needle point. You might need a magnifying glass to see that little point where you pricked yourself. That is a chi. And my mother used to say, before you go hunting, ask your grandfather for some chi sawan. Chi sawan is, I didn't know at the time, but eventually I found out, it's the moose nose that we take. When we kill a moose, we take the moose nose and we cut it up and clean it and cut it up, and each one of those is a chi. Chi. Sawan means to cut. So that's how that word, that concept came out. So what it says then is a repeat. What each one of those moose nose pieces is a part. That little pinpoint that you see is a particle. We're talking about particles. Repeating particles. Did I interpret that right? Repeating particles. You're good, positive, repeating particles. You're in a state of good, positive, repeating particles. This is what health is. So, what dancing particle comes around. I couldn't really understand. How do I go back? I couldn't really understand what that would be talking about. The only way, how much time do I have? You have to keep me. I know, but I don't want to. I just want to take my time. Give me about 20 minutes, okay? How much time did I take already? 10? Okay, I'm on track. Okay. Because I think it's quite important when we're talking about repeating particles, and there has to be a way, and we're still researching that, how we can explain it in Cree. But for the sake, okay, good. For the sake of understanding, and because I talk to Western researchers and academics and etc., the way that they might understand. The way I talk about it is there's a synchrotron, a large hadron collider in Switzerland, and France border, 50 miles this way, 50 miles around. There's one synchrotron in Saskatchewan, but that's a toy, I think. It's only about a few hundred yards around. The Large Hadron Collider cost billions of dollars to create. And scientists, hundreds and thousands of scientists working on that. And what they do is shoot a particle this way and shoot a particle this way. They collide them over there almost at the speed of light. And then what they hope to discover is the God particle. The God particle, as Leroy Lilbert tells me, is that from pure energy, you have energy, and then something happens that creates matter, something tangible like this, from energy into something. It's what the God particle, he tells me, is that little particle that will make that shift happen from energy into matter. That's what they call the God particle. And so we talked about it, but so if that's what they're looking for, that God particle. Now, if they ever discover the God particle, imagine the scientists over there, they'll be on the front page news of the Globe and Mail, they'll be on your news, they'll be Nobel Peace Prize, they'll be Nobel they'll get that prize, and all of us peasants down here will be looking up at them and say, these are gods. They have discovered something so brilliant. But if they went to our elders and told them about these particles, what the elders would tell them, what? We've been working with those things for thousands of years. We've been working with those particles for thousands of years. You're just discovering them, and you're getting a Nobel Peace Prize for that. We have names for those particles, the elders would tell them, our old people would tell them. We have songs for those particles, the elders would tell them. We have protocols, a way to treat these particles, the elders would tell them. We have worked with these things for thousands of years. And so we have in our ceremonies practical ways of taking nothing into something. You come into our sweat lodge, I'll give you from nothing into something, that you can walk away from that sweat lodge and you'll have something, the good health of your children, a good mind, a good body, good health. But not only that, you're just trying to discover taking energy into something. Well, we can also tell you about taking something and turning it into nothing. The reverse. You come here with your sickness, I'll tell you, I'll show you, I'll do it. I'll take your sickness and turn it into nothing. This is what we call healing. So it's not only a creation of nothing into something, it's also our elders have been doing this for thousands of years, knew how to take something and turn it into nothing. These are not new ideas. This comes from the language. Ask the language if you don't believe me. This is what I'm extracting from this. And the old people talk about this in their daily conversation. Where is our research headed? So when we talk about dancing particles, what we start to picture, the way I picture it is, if these are repeating particles, you know, the detectors they have at the Large Hadron Collider, they don't see these particles, but they have detectors, and what they show is little lights coming on and fizzing out again. All these little lights happening. And so that's that picture. That's why I include that. And I see people walking around just like with all these particles going like this. You know, some people, as you got up this morning, you might have, when you jumped out of bed, you know, just landed on 2 feet raring to go, your particles were like this. And those of you that were just barely getting up, you know, just kind of rolling out of bed, kind of flopping on the floor, take your particles might have been like this. Go on a 5th floor at the university here, a university hospital. Peek around those rooms where you'll see some people like this. Particles ready to go. That's how I picture it. Am I going crazy, Brent? So, this is how we want to be. If that's what's happening, if I'm interpreting right, and that's what's happening to all of us, that, you know, when you're like this, can you tell me when you met your boyfriend, your spouse? Do you remember that time? Yeah. What attracted you to your, you know, what attracted you? Of course, it's like this, because this attracts. This does not attract. You don't want to be like that. But when we encounter other human beings, the youth, and I was thinking about that with the youth when they were talking, how many times have they met social workers or encountered the West, and the people that they were looking at were like this. The people that were supposed to be working with them were looking at them like this. The people they connected with were like this. That could communicate with them were like this. So that's the dancing particles. And of course, what you're looking at there, ladies and gentlemen, have a real good look at it. What you're looking at is the Mayo Clinic. People have done our work. Our old people have done the work. We can talk, I can talk like this because they've done the research. They've done the work. They haven't been sitting around being colonized. They haven't been sitting around listening to the discourse about how many thousands of people we have on diabetes medicines and how many need help. That is something they recognize as an external influence on their humanity. So the Mayo Clinic, you talk about these particles. The last resort for many cases that I know of, for example, that have cancer, doctors have written them off. And their last resort has been with our healing ways. And what do they do in the sweat lodge once they come in? What does the elder do? Right away, they take their rattle. They take their drums. They sing their beautiful songs. They talk to these particles. They sing the songs for those particles, and they do the protocol for those particles, and they negotiate with those particles. I know you as Cancer, Mr. Cancer, Mrs. Cancer, I know you want a long life. So does this person wants a long life. How can we negotiate that both of you have a long life? It's not a war. It's about protocol. It's about ethics. How we treat sentient creatures. How you treat your dog. How you treat... Do you have mice in your house? No. Why not? Sentient creatures. Be a little bit more ethical. Bring some mice into your... How do we treat sentient creatures? The grass, the trees, the environment. How do we treat particles? How do we treat cancer? So ethical space is about our inner selves, our particles, the unseen, unspoken influences, matters of heart and spirit, the spiritual, the deeper inwardness of people, the real energies between people, the morals, values, ethics, substantial relationships, and so forth in research. Turn it over to Reginald. And I hope he doesn't make a decree.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Good morning. Morning, Willie, and it's always a pleasure to talk with Willie on many topics that we talk about, and I'd like to honor the elder this morning. Thanks for your prayers and acknowledging Creator. I'll try and continue the story this morning, and when I listen to Willie, and he talks about these energies and the spirit that these energies represent or a part of, I think it's important that we understand that those are animate also. They're part of what in our way. And I'm Blackfoot, and we share a lot in common in oral practices. But in Blackfoot, we have a word, and the word is Gimmapipitsin. Gimmapipitsin is a principle that we live by, and that Gimmapipitsin means a sanctified kindness for everything. Plants, animals, a bug is kind to another bug, a grass is kind to another grass. And I think those are principles that we need to understand, go deep within our belief systems as who we are. I want to continue the story to talk about the practical concepts of how we might understand those principles, or how we might act out those principles. When we talk about concepts of ethical space, how do we practice ethical space? I talked to a lot of the elders, and the elders I'm always worried, saying to them, how do I take your knowledge? There's so much knowledge. I want to know as much as I can and ask you a lot of questions. But a lot of times the elders are saying you have to understand the processes, the models, and the practices. If you can understand those, then you can tap the knowledge of elders, the knowledge of the elder this morning, and also Willie's knowledge, because of those oral practices. So when we talk about oral practices, we have just that, oral practices that came from our oral worldview, which is different to a Western worldview. So I want to talk to you this morning about the differences between the two practices, oral practice and a written practice that we talk about today. We also want to look at that oral practice from our perspective, the concepts that Willie talked about, and the practical concepts of oral practices that ties into the information that Willie also talks about this morning. So cultural who was important in our way. Cultural who was, I got a habit of standing by the mic while I'm wearing a mic. Cultural who, part of the topics we looked at was who are we culturally, but also we needed to identify worldview. What is the worldviews? And when we talk about worldviews, we do have worldviews from a Western perspective and an oral perspective. And sometimes we tend to mix those worldviews up. And once we mix those worldviews up, we end up in a concept that the elders talk about, in the concept of cultural confusion. Sometimes we start mixing two cultures together. So we talked to our elders, and through that discussion, we tried to identify ayapi chimstai. In Western language, I guess we would talk about white man thinkers, or translated to white man thinkers. And the concept that the elders came up with is what they heard at residential school, what they heard during the colonial process, the Indian agent, the Northwest Mounted Police. Those were the principles of that cultural, or that colonization tools. But what they heard from them was the concept that God gave dominion to man, and dominion gave them all that superiority to be able to make decisions on behalf of all creation. And out of that concept of dominion to man, they talked about the practices, the written practices, and the written language, and the written stories. And the elders would talk in our language. They would say, well, if you're going to talk in a legal context in the Western world, you need to talk the same as the written language. Then you're talking in a legal context. So they talked about those concepts and how those concepts were a part of a lot of the Western institutions, such as church, education, and governance. And the products that came out of Western practices that were developed of, say, for example, governance, then we're talking about the products that come out that shows that you have a privilege or a right that has been given to you. So for example, we might talk about driver's license. Having a driver's license gives you a privilege to drive, but you need to go to a system, a governance system, and do your test and pay your fee. And once you're passed, once you're evaluated, then you're given a driver's license. But we have licenses, permits, and certificates. If you went through an institution, at the end, you get a certificate saying that you passed. But ownership was also what was important. They talked about ownership as being individual ownership. And sometimes when I come from a collective ownership, and sometimes I forget myself, I take my driver's license and I give it to Willie and I say, here, drive to town. And those are the basic differences. So we talked about the elders, and the elders talked about Echitapikshimsta, the Indian thinkers. And in our stories, in our creation stories, we talked about everything being equal. The elders talk about stories of creation where plants, animals, the space, the stars, the human beings, everything was equal. Nobody had superiority or was higher than anybody else. Everything and everybody was equal. And out of that concept of equal, our systems were evolved. We defined the environments that we were in. For example, there's many environments. There's the environment where I come from within the Blackfoot language, but there's the West Coast, the East Coast, the Inuit. So there is a lot of different environments, and it's those environments that we defined where we come from. Language was important, and oral stories were so important. We talk about oral stories. Those oral stories give us the concepts or the traditional knowledge to take on our challenges. And the oral systems are also a part of our institutions, whether they're ceremonies or education. But we talk also about the ownership and the products that come out of an oral system. So if I needed documentation of rights and privileges that I do have, then I'd be looking at the concept of songs. And Willie talked about songs and how important songs are. Songs also are your physical documentations of, if you went through an institution and you passed the evaluation, then you're given a song from that institution to be your official document that you passed. And it's so important that we look at those songs as validation of something real. But when I was young, I joined a society called the Little Birds and the Chickadees. And when I finished those age grade education levels in the oral culture, I was given a song. So at that age, when that song was given to me, part of our belief system is that song was a collective survival for everybody. So my certificate or my report card from that age grade level was given to me for the survival of everybody. So songs and physical documentations go together. So when you look at two thinkers, you look at a white man thinker and an Indian thinker, and you start recognizing there's definitely two concepts or systems or practices that we talk about in believing from our worldviews. When I was young, and I was at my grandmother's, a lot of times I knew how to deal with my challenges. And the way I dealt with my challenges was, first of all, I knew who Creator was. I knew my language. I knew my oral practices and processes, and I knew what the products were. I knew what songs were. That was my whole worldview, who I was as a First Nation. And so every time I had a challenge, that's the world I went into. But then one day I found myself, my mother got sick and she went to the Camsell Hospital because she had TB. But when she left the family, we were all delivered to the residential school. And I was 5 years old at the time when I first experienced residential school. But even those younger years, I ended up in a classroom. And the classroom came from a Western perspective. The classroom came from a worldview that had a concept of dominion. So once I got into a classroom, I was in a whole different teaching model. And when I was in that classroom, I tried to say, my songs are my validation of at least knowing numbers and formulas in our way. So I was punished for that. I couldn't speak my language because that was the worldview I came from, was my language. But I also couldn't show that I knew different levels of math because that was all a different system. So for example, I would take, when I was with little birds and chickadees, I would take my symbols as animals, plants, fingers, toes. Those were my oral symbols. But my formulas were iskanumahka, ani tumahka, ni chitapuyi, ni chim. These were my traditional formulas that I used to calculate answers. And then, of course, we had our answers. So that's how I understood math. And once I passed a certain level of math, we even had a math song which certifies you that you went through that level and you use that song. So, but when I got into the classroom, I was given numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I was also given the concept of plus, minus as formulas, plus, minus, equal, and answers. So once I was challenged at residential school, for example, in math, all of a sudden I ended up putting the whole picture together, the plants and animals and anitumahka and plus and minus and numbers and songs and so on, all in a big grouping. So every time I got a challenge from the math teacher, somehow through all this, I start thinking of answers, and I'll throw any answer out. Sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong. But it was bringing those two, an oral practice and a Western practice together and mixing them up. And the elders, when we started talking about those concepts, the elders talked about saying, well, that is what we talk about when we look at cultural confusion. When you take those both cultures, put them together, and you mix them up, and then all of a sudden, you're trying to find answers. You're challenged. Today, we're challenged in many, talking about cultural safety, cultural competency. When you're challenged with those kind of issues, then all of a sudden, you start bringing the cultures together, and you're looking at cultural confusion. So those are parts of what I remember from residential school, and cultural confusion was one of the biggest things that we ended up at residential school with. So I just wanted to say that there is Indian thinkers, white man thinkers, and then sometimes we talk about Manakims, the modern thinkers that used both, but also we got to be aware that cultural confusion is something that the elders talk about. We also, the elders wanted to talk about how do we avoid cultural confusion? Well, cultural interpretation and cultural translations are so important. we can have literal translations, but sometimes the meanings don't come out. So we need to look at the cultural translations and interpretation. To find parallel meanings is another concept that was so important to the elders. Elders talking about pulling the two cultures apart and finding parallels. And the parallels you find are going to be your best practices to move ahead. And we're talking about ethical space, then what are some of those parallels that I want to talk about later? So also they wanted to talk about the concept of regulated systems. We have regulated systems. If we talk about how do we get our songs, how do we get what do we use our songs for, and how do they become physical documentations of rights and privileges? And all those come from oral practices. So we do have quite complicated regulated systems. So an understanding of that is so important. It's a lot of times industry comes, I used to be the chief for our community, and industry would come to the community and talk about developing traditional property or reserve property. And once they come in, they talk about, we only have so much time, we only have so much money to invest, we need to get this done, and let's move on. And a lot of times they're missing the understanding of cultural practices or First Nation practices. So my argument is that whether it's government or industry coming to First Nation communities, you need to buy time so that you can save resource or money at the end. So you need to start engaging into long-term community investment to find out about what is Willie talking about, what am I talking about, what are the elders saying. I think to find those parallels is so important, because if you find those parallels, then we can move a lot faster when we're working with First Nation communities. And also, when you go into First Nation communities, we in our community, we are Beak Gunny Blackfoot community. But once you come in, there's white man thinkers, Indian thinkers, and modern thinkers. That when you develop programs and come into the community, those programs can't be generic. You have to consider the three categories. No, maybe I moved ahead to it. Okay, I just want to talk about everything was created equal and everybody was equal. So we look at, in our communities, we come from specific geographic locations. Willie comes from a geographic location. Elder Cardinal comes from a geographic location. Our languages are different. Our beliefs are, and our stories are also different, but in some cases they're pretty similar. So when we talk about jurisdiction, we believe that songs tie us to the lands that we live in. So if I need medicine from a plant, then I need to get that. Since I'm not superior to the plant, so I can't give Willie a plant to start healing with. We need to ask that plant to be kind to us through this concept of kindness, and through an oral ceremony, transfer the song of that plant through the ceremony to Willie or myself to be able to use it to support our community. So jurisdiction is always to the land. We always get authority from the lands we live in. And that was so important in our case. So songs tie us to that land. I just want to say one story from our area. When we have a place called Napi's Playground, and Napi was one of our heroes, our characters, our crazy characters, smart characters, but he was all that. And Napi, one time, he knew the Kootenays to the west were terrific gamblers, so he challenged them, and everybody was saying, we're going to lose everything. Napi challenged the Kootenays. They came across the mountain, and there's a place called Napi's Playground. So they challenged them to a hoop and arrow game. And every game, Napi lost. And our people were getting worried. We were going to lose the whole Old Man River Valley. But Napi, one game, would bet the bugs and bet the stars and bet the plants and slowly kept losing. Finally, at the end, he bet everything. He bet all or nothing. And in the last game, he ended up winning. And when he won, he sang his victory song, and he danced his victory dance because he won. And the Kootenays went back across the mountain. So those are one of our stories with a song. And those are jurisdictions that tie us to that land. Napi's Playground is within the Porcupine Hills, and that's where we come from. But when we go across the mountains, when I was young, I used to go across the mountains with my parents, and on one end, the Kootenays would stack up their trade goods, and the Blackfoot on the other end. And before they traded, they would sing Napi's song and dance Napi's victory dance. And once that was done, they would start trading. Later on, I was reading in David Thompson's journals, and in his journals, he said he was trading with the Kootenays on the east side of the mountains, and the Blackfoot attacked him. And there was a skirmish for a couple days, but at the end, he said he won the skirmish, and then he also entered saying the Blackfeet were jealous that he was trading with the Kootenays. So I took that story back to the elders and talked to them about the story. And they said, well, if you look at the skirmish with David Thompson, if David Thompson would have paid a fee to one of those warriors to sing Napi's Playground, they would have let him trade. The song, Napi's Playground song, that was a permit to trade. And that was the whole reasoning behind that story. Today we have U.S.-Canada trade agreements. But if I went into the U.S. without following those laws or those trade agreements, of course they're going to throw me in jail in Montana if I do my trade. So that's a governance structure and jurisdiction tied to it. When we talk about our jurisdiction, Napi's Playground is only one example of how we would look at trade. So when I go into Willie's territory or Elder Cardinal's territory, they have songs, they have stories that allow us to trade, and I need to ask for those stories. When we're talking about health, the right to health, if I'm in their territory and I get sick, I'm going to have to ask for their right through songs to health so that I can be treated. It's going to be illegal. If I went into, it's going to be disrespectful, not also illegal also, but to go into their territory and start using my song, I'm going to get into trouble, and vice versa. So those practice principles are so important when we look at geographic territory of First Nations, where their languages come from, where their practices come from, and how jurisdiction ties them to that land. That's so important when we're working with First Nations. We were talking about concepts of developing practices. And during that discussion, the elders talked about we have natural laws. Natural laws are a blade of grass, once it gets water and sun, it's going to grow. That's natural law. But also in that territories you come from or geographic location, there's natural law all around you. And the way we define that natural law is going to be the way we defined who we are. And stories are so a big part of that. So we have many stories, creation stories and stories that identify who we are. But those stories define that natural law. And those stories become absolute laws. So the stories that our elders have, those stories are absolute laws, and their knowledge, the oral knowledge that is validated as true knowledge through songs. So today, when we're looking at modern day challenges, we need to go back to those stories. We need to go back to those elders, listen to those stories, and extract how we're going to move ahead or what practices exist. I think that's so important. So when we're looking at ethical space, we need to go back to those stories, those songs, and those concepts of when we talk about the spirit concept. All those tied together through songs and stories is so important, because that's who we are from the territories we come from. We need to go back to that resource. One elder put it this way when I was listening to him. He said, if you look at white man's story, there was a place that was their environment that was called the Holy Land. And in the Holy Land, there was a man that his people never listened to him when he was leading. So he went up into his mountain to talk to his Creator, and his Creator gave him writing on stone. He brought that writing on stone back to his people, and he led his people through those writing on stone. He said, today, those writing on stone are still strong, because if I do something wrong, I'm going to end up in jail. So when you look at the concepts of stories being absolute laws, Moses and the Ten Commandments is a story that are principles that are used to develop the justice system. So if we said, well, let's change the Moses story and let's say it happened this way or that way, can you imagine the justice system today scrambling to try and make adjustments in the system? So that's how important our stories are through our songs and our oral practices. Those stories are our traditional knowledge. We had a discussion with Willie and I, and he was talking about a health project where the elders were wanting to help Western practitioners with traditional knowledge, and so that they can serve First Nations better. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the project, the elders walked out and said they didn't want to. I think the words were, if we keep giving our knowledge to the Western practitioners, they're going to get fatter and fatter in our knowledge, and we're going to get skinnier and skinnier with our traditional knowledge. And once we discussed it, we looked at the concept that there is a maintenance system in Western practices. That maintenance systems are resources, programs, research projects, jobs, and financial resources. That's maintenance systems that maintain Western knowledge and even expand Western knowledge. But you go to what the elders are saying, we're getting skinnier and skinnier. It's because we're not feeding them. Where are the resources? Where are the jobs? Where are the research projects? Where are the health projects, for example? Where are they? They're not being maintained. They're not maintaining the oral systems at all to maintain or develop traditional knowledge so we can keep going. So those are challenges that you're looking at today in your organizations. Our stories are important. They convey everything in words and songs and images and the songs prove that rights and privileges. Now I'm going to move ahead quite a bit here. in our way we have models, but we also have processes. So those are when we start talking about the concept of practicing ethical space, models and processes are so important, because the spiritual, the abstract concept of value, morals, and principles are there. We need to start looking at also how would we look at culturally interpreting ethical space that we look at today, not only in research, but in many areas. So first thing we looked at was, what is a model? Our models to make decisions for the Plains tribes and the Blackfoot were TP models. And different geographic areas have different models. Inuit have different models. Western and East Coast have long houses, therefore they're going to have different models. But there's many models. A model is a model, a replica of what existed. Our processes for when we talk about getting something done, we need to go through a process. 1, 2, 3, and getting something done. If you miss one step, then you're not going through a process. So for example, Western processes, if you're going to make a resolution, then you need to, somebody's got to make a motion, discussion, and then you have your vote, and once the vote is done, the minutes are done and sent out. So those are Western concepts of processes. Our process of processes are, in an oral culture, are venue, action, language, and song. Who got together, or which group of people got together, and how did they demonstrate their abilities and qualifications, and also the spoken expression. So when I talk about chickadees and little birds, it's education. But if I talk about the brave dogs and the warrior societies, naturally it's protection. If I talk about the beaver bundles, then I'm talking legislative. If I'm talking Sundance, I'm talking sovereign. So it's the different concepts in the language, or the discourse in the language. And of course the song is a demonstration that you had a right and privilege, such as the chickadee song. So venue, action, language, and song is a process from an oral culture that's so important to validate what is a person, place, or thing, if it's real. And those are concepts that we look at, and we found in other First Nations have the same concepts when they're looking at their songs and processes. Within those songs, we also look at the concept of, the machine is a little bit slow here. Within the songs, we have the songs and the process, we have the models, but when we look at our First Nation organizations, for example, when we look at the circle model, the TP model, that represents an organization or a group that comes together. That organization coming together has a flow within that organization. That flow is going to be shared purpose, complex organization, knowledge centricity within that organization. This is a drawing from 1910 of the Brave Dogs organization, and within their organization they have their members, they have their executive, you might say, they have their leadership, but within that organization they have a shared purpose. The story of the Brave Dogs, or the story from the dogs that give them the authority to come together as a group, and the chiefs who are responsible for that organization. So those were the Brave Dogs organizational flow, and they all have their flow within each organization. I talk about the Brave Dogs, the chickadees, the healers, and beaver bundles. All these are many circles within a community, a First Nation community. There is many circles. And those circles represent different levels of administration providers or governance providers within that community. So we can imagine many circles. Once a circle is formed, people from those circles come together into one teepee, and once they come together in that teepee, they represent a complex organization. And that complex organization come together with respect, honor, truth, trust, and accepting each other. Once they come together in a teepee with those principles, then that teepee model becomes an ethical space where they can have a cultural safe place to discuss what they need to discuss and come out with solutions with their protocols. So all those models to get together to have meetings were culturally safe models that we call ethical space also. Brave Dogs, they had their way of dress, but as I was talking, within an organizational flow, we called them ukakisin societies. Ukakisin means intelligent societies or organizations. And within those many organizations, they have shared purposes and so on. Now, those shared purposes bring the organization together, but the models they use to come together are ethical space models that include the principles that Willie's talking about and the practical principles that I've heard elders talk about through my different travels. Here's an example of the chickadees in a learning model that they use within their formal circles. We have the floor plan in our justice model, for example, is an ethical space. And when you come into historically to talk about justice, this is what you're going to encounter. Today we might walk into a court and we see a judge in his robes and the legal staff in a courthouse. We automatically know where we are. And we're used to it. Historically, we go into a same kind of judicial concept, and this is what we used to see, and we were used to it. We knew what we were going to discuss once we went into that circle. But that circle that they're sitting in is an ethical space with those values, those spiritual, those abstract, those physical practices and protocols all coming together in honor, respect, truth, and safety. So those were the models that we were familiar with from our culture. So within, this is the model when we talk about breaking it down and the different cultural parts to it. But one of the things we need to look at is talk about, for example, when we talk about ethical space and the difference between two cultures together, coming together, and how that complex a meeting comes together and creates a lot of problems. So we talk about our chief sitting behind Eagle Tail Feather, going to signing Treaty Number 7 in 1877, and Commissioner Leard coming on the other side with the treaty to sign. First of all, sitting on Eagle Tail Feather, and what the elders say is our jurisdiction for health, education, or anything we need to survive comes through songs as physical documentation. Those songs tie us directly to the geographic lands that we come from. So that's our inherent right to that health and education. When we went to sign the treaty, we signed a peace treaty. We never gave up our Chickadee song that represented education. We never gave up our health songs that represented our right to health. Those were all inherent rights that he took with him. When he went to sign the treaty, he took with him 4 songs to our geographic territory. Sitting on Eagle Tail Feather, took with him Porcupine Hills, Crow Lodge Creek, Napi's Playground, and the source of the Oman River. That was a geographic territory, and his songs were his titles and deeds, physical deeds to that land he came from. And that's what he took with him to the signing of treaty. Also, on the other side, Commissioner Leard came with the treaty, a written documentation, and his concepts of what brought him to the treaty and what authorities gave him the right to come and get the treaty signed. So 2 of them, when they met, didn't understand each other. First, they had 2 different worldviews. Secondly, they had 2 different languages. Thirdly, you're looking at 2 different management systems. One management system is an impromptu management system in the oral culture that gets their authority from their songs and the lands that they come from, and the responsibility goes to leadership in humans as the leaders in the community, and they survive that way. And then they had their products, of course, which is the songs. On the other side, Commissioner Leard had a worldview that the elders talk about, Dominion worldview. He spoke and wrote Western language and stories, but he also came from, at the time in 1877, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The Maslows and the Adam Smiths were already developing school of management, and they're saying part of those principles is to control resources. At that time, they were building the railroad across Canada, and that wasn't for the people. It was to control resources. Decisions were being made in Ottawa through a bureau management system that came from the School of Management to control resources, and the treaty came from those principles. So it was a different management system, and their documents, the written documents, were the physical documents that showed their rights and privileges. So all of a sudden you're looking at 2 different cultures, different systems, different belief systems coming together to sign the treaty. And when they didn't understand each other, confusion goes to conflict. And we've been dealing with cultural confusion ever since. So we need to start looking at how do we look at solutions. And solutions that we're looking for are concepts of ethical space. How do we get together to talk about OCAP principles, our ownership of our information? Ownership of our information is showed through our songs, our ceremonies. That's First Nation ownership, Indigenous ownership, through our language. Sometimes we work with Western organizations. They'll gather our elders together, they'll talk in our language, and they'll come up with solutions. And of course, Western organizations will write up the results, and then they'll go back and put it into their policies. Because they paid for that meeting, they feel that they own the information that came out of that meeting. But really, the elder that prayed, that made that floor a formal ethical space to discuss our whatever we're going to discuss, just sanctioned that information as Indigenous information. And it was taken from that meeting because somebody else paid for it. And then that information is used in the wrong way sometimes. So information is so important that we maintain ownership, but we need to understand what is ownership. When we talk about buying community investment in First Nations, part of that community investment is finding out how do we validate ownership and information is owned by First Nation. How do we come together in an ethical space so that we can negotiate the use of Indigenous information? So it's so important when we look at the practice of ethical space. The practice of ethical space we look at are the models that we use that came from our systems. But also, those models has a spirit. They have a flash and a lighting with them, because that's what comes into those models to make it a whole being. And we call ourselves, in many First Nations, real people. And as real people, and we become real, we need those many flashes, but we also need the models, the physical models, to come together so that we are real beings, or ni chitapi, the way we say it in our language. So those are concepts. When we talk about cultural safety and we talk about cultural competency, we've got to understand it's not a Western policy developed interpretation of competency that we need. We need our own competency models. And we've just talked about how complicated our regulated systems are, but we need to start in that direction to talk to our elders about what spirit is, about what practical practices are, what are songs, what are ethical spaces, how do we validate people with the right traditional knowledge, professional knowledge in our culture, to be able to talk to us. We have our cultural elders. The elders from the chickadees are elders to the little birds, and the chickadees are only 5 and 6 years old, and the little birds are 4 years old. How can you be an elder at 5 years old? Well, we were when we were part of our system. I was an elder at 5 years old to the little birds. So those concepts are built right within our societies, but those are cultural elders we look at as we move ahead. How do we culturally interpret and culturally translate the concept of elders? If we just literally take Western concept of elders, then we're talking about, when do I fall within the government guidelines for seniors programs, 65 years and older? So those are some of the concepts that we talk about when we look at ethical space. So with that, I'd just like to thank you, and if there's any questions, I don't know if we have time for questions, but if there's any questions, maybe Willie and I can entertain those questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you both elders for just wonderful words. And my question is, I'm with the Alberta Centre for Child Family Research, and we're one of the organizers, but we're, I guess, one of those Western organizations that tries to fund research, mobilize knowledge. And I think I heard you say, Reg, where is the research related to traditional knowledge and practice? And if I understood what you were saying, and we're an organization that could go forward and try to support that, but should we be involved? What advice do you have for us in terms of supporting or trying to move that forward? Or do you think that's something that we should stay back from because of our approach and perhaps our misunderstanding of the processes, the models, and the tools you talked about today, and the history?
I think it's important when we look at community investment, when we're looking at community relations with First Indigenous people, First Nations. And that concept should be looking at, for example, I talked about how Western knowledge is being maintained or even enhanced through the maintenance of, and the maintenance principles being the dollars, the programs, the research programs, organizational goals and objectives. But how do we culturally interpret resources? How do we culturally interpret programs? For example, we talk about one program, the elders up north were getting together to talk about medicines. They had enough resources amongst themselves to come together in a small group to talk about, to have a ceremony and talk about medicines and to support the knowledge of these medicines. There was a few of them that got together. But on the other hand, there was a government agency that wanted an elders advisory, so they brought in elders from a greater area. So they were able to justify their dollars and their programs to bring those elders together. But the definition of elders, or the validation of elders, came from a Western perspective, a Western policy. They defined elders, not us. And it's through that Western definition of elders that they brought the elders together and spent the expense to bring them together and provided the logistics for that meeting, to have that meeting. But on the other side, these guys got together on whatever they had. How do we support them to bring in a larger group? And that's cultural interpretation of those dollars, not only in logistics, but also in human resource support or recordings or whatever they need or whatever the elders want. But you also have to accept to go into their ethical space. If they're having a ceremony, they have their protocols, they have their languages, they have their right to say this is knowledge that can be recorded. And those need to be recorded at that time, at that space, so that we can develop our knowledge as we move ahead. So it's so important translating those resources into maintenance systems that we need to develop that aren't any different than Western maintenance models.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. My name is Sharon Pasul. I'm Métis Cree on my mother's side. When you talked about cultural confusion, and you mentioned white man thinker, Indian thinker, and then modern thinkers, would you consider modern thinkers to be synchronistic or no? Syncretistic or no?
Consider it being that, because when I hear the elders talking about modern, Monaxim stacks were the ones that can take Western processes and what they knew from our cultural processes and be able to find parallels. But sometimes they're not heard. A lot of times, sometimes I hear stories about interpreters at signing treaties, and some of them were both First Nation and non-First Nation, and they were the interpreters. But they took concepts and tried to present them, but the concepts that they presented were not accepted in an ethical space or ethical understanding. Their concepts were accepted by Western bureau management systems and policies. So it really put them in a place where they weren't understood. They could have done a lot more at the treaty if they were considered, their information was considered. So I always look at those concepts of those stories, because in treaty stories, the signing of treaties, the interpreters always were heroes or villain, you know. So and that's what the elders were talking about.
Thank you. If a non-Indigenous person presided over a smudging ceremony, would you consider that an appropriation of culture?
I don't think it's an appropriation of culture, but what, if you're going to provide, if I'm going to proceed over a Western meeting, what is my validation to stand at that boardroom table to chair that meeting? What is my membership to be a part of that group? How did I get validated to stand up there and run that meeting? I think if you take those same principles and cross-culturally interpret those, we need to look at community investment and finding out, how do we validate, how do we become those leaders to preside over a smudge ceremony that's a gathering. I think those are so important because a lot of times that's happening without any validation. And when that, without validation, then you're getting into cultural confusion, and cultural confusion is going to lead you down conflict.
Thank you. So what kind of, do you have any suggestions, or is there a place when I could go to develop or learn about these types of validations?
I think that's the point. When we're talking about funding, Reg mentioned that every time we open our mouths as Indigenous people, it seems that the channels are that our words, our actions, our knowledge are channeled into the university. They're channeled into policy makers, into governance, and all these. So this is what they call appropriation, of course, appropriation of knowledge, which is a key word for research, you know, for researchers to think about. So we make them, those institutions, fat by that process. Vine Deloria said, research right now should stop right now. All research concerning Indigenous people should stop right now until we fix those, we repair what's wrong with the whole system. And so our process of being caught up in that, you know, we can even think about it as social engineering by colonialism, that because of culture confusion, we think it is the government, it is the Western world, it's the European society that does everything. You know, our own people have been caught up with that. We don't believe in our ceremonies anymore, our language and everything like that. And therefore, consequently, you know, we've been getting leaner and leaner and leaner. And the point we're trying to make with all these ideas is that our ideas have to prevail so that our systems have the same level of funding, that our knowledge system has a level playing field, that, you know, the governance in this country has to recognize that as much money as they inject into the Tri-Council, you know, where all the research funding goes into, those amounts have to be channeled into our communities as well, not necessarily through research, but through different processes. So unless those things happen, you know, we would love to have our own institutions, our own universities, our own buildings where we can teach culture. We'd love to have our own infrastructure, our own programs, our own funding money, our own maintenance money for everything that happens in the West should be happening in our communities, and that's the point we're trying to make. You know, I think that's what we have to think about. And you know, you all have a mouth. The elders tell us to use your brains that have been given to you. Use the mouth that has been given to you to not necessarily advocate, but to work. Use your skills that you've developed as researchers, as academics, as writers, to push for these things to happen. And that's why we have these, you know. We have to channel our energies to make these things happen and stop feeding those Western institutions and systems as they get fatter and fatter. In the meantime, you know, we're begging for something in our community to do the necessary memory work that needs to be done. We need to put those cultural forests in our communities where the 5-year-olds become our elders to teach the 4-year-olds and etc. And the women to teach the young ladies and all those things to happen. Those things, you know, we have to do that. We have to do that. And you, right now, each one of you, you've been given that challenge, that responsibility, because you heard it now. Make those particles sparkle.
Thank you. Thank you for your information and your knowledge. We're talking about the basics of knowledge and even how you can conduct smudging. I'm a survivor of residential school, but because I got lost through that, I made up my mind to look for who I am, and it's been almost 40 years doing it. And the elders that I followed in the oral teachings, they say once you find someone you can trust to learn all that you can from that person, you don't become that leader until your leader passes on into the other world. So it takes a lot of dedication to become the ceremonial maker or the teacher of whoever you're following. And when it comes to learning about those ancient songs, it takes a lot of commitment and dedication to do that too, and all the ceremonial practices. So it takes a long time to talk about taking practices. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Myself, I feel like you've just given me a whole new language to talk about these differences. It's quite phenomenal. I think we're probably all a little overwhelmed with such wisdom. So I thank you very much. I'd like to give you each a gift.